Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 12, Video 3. This is going to be the longest video of this chapter series because we're talking about heuristics. And heuristics, there's lots of them, and I think are some of the more fun parts of the chapter. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to go through a quick overview of what heuristics are, and then we're going to be looking at a few heuristics individually to talk about how they play into our everyday decision making. So just to kind of introduce you to the topic, what heuristics are essentially shortcuts. They are shortcuts that our mind uses to make decisions. They're simple, they're efficient. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time trying to reason or trying to use logic or trying to organize our thoughts, because we can just simply apply this shortcut that will help us make decisions. So oftentimes these are good. Oftentimes heuristics are good and they help us make the right decision in our day-to-day lives. But the examples that we're going to be looking at in this chapter are usually going to be instances in which heuristics lead us to the wrong conclusion. And so I'm not trying to say that heuristics are bad, but they can be bad, but for the most part, they're good. For the most part, they just help us in the same way that schemas help our memory, heuristics help our decision making. All right, so we only really kind of notice them when we start talking about incorrect decisions, and that's something that we're going to talk about as well when we talk about problem solving in a different chapter. So the ones that we're going to be focusing on in this video are representativeness, availability, and anchoring. So representativeness is kind of an extension of our conversation about base rate neglect, which we talked about in the previous video. That essentially whenever we are given a piece of evidence, we are going to try to fit that into our pre-existing knowledge of the world. And so if someone is asking you to make a decision about a baseball team, you're going to compare that baseball team to what you already know about other baseball teams. That doesn't mean that you're doing that statistically, that you're like looking at numbers and stuff like that, but more kind of ideologically. So if I were to, say, referring back to the previous example, that hey, I have a friend I want you to meet. He has a forklift operator, and I already used the gendered pronoun he, but I think what would probably pop into most people's heads if I mentioned a forklift operator is probably somebody who's a guy. Probably somebody who has some college education or less, somebody who does not come from a super privileged background, and you get the idea. Somebody who typically is good with mechanics. Now, all of that stuff is just a stereotype. Everything that I just said is a stereotype, right? Like, that's just stuff that pops into our head whenever we talk about, for example, a forklift operator. So it doesn't make it true, right? But it can be an efficient way to make decisions. But in the previous example, where we talked about that in the last video, we talked about how that led us into the wrong direction, that we ignored the actual evidence in order to make that. So representativeness heuristic isn't always good. So it is kind of related to prototype theory, which we talked about in the concept chapter, because essentially what we're doing is whenever you hear, a forklift operator, you have this idea of the forklift operator, and you're going to compare it to, or you're going to make your decisions based on that prototype of that specific concept. Another example would be like if I said, hey, I want to introduce you to my friend. They are a preschool teacher. If you heard that, the first thing that pops into your head is probably going to be, if we're playing in gender stereotypes, probably going to be a woman and not a man, right? And the reason for that is because most of us grew up and probably had a preschool teacher that was a woman, right? And we think of that in that regard. Definitely doesn't make it true, but is an example of how this heuristic can lead us into the wrong direction. So related to this is something called the conjunction fallacy. And the conjunction fallacy there is a little bit of math involved in this, but don't freak out. I'm not going to get you to calculate anything on the exam. Basically, conjunction fallacies are whenever we make a decision about something and we lump in two characteristics about it instead of just one. So the probability of two things happening can never be greater than the probability of one of those things happening by itself. By definition, by mathematical properties, if two things happen, that probability cannot be greater than if one of those happened independently on its own. So just to kind of show you what I mean here is that if we're looking at the probability of, I don't know, let's say the probability of somebody being a lawyer and somebody being from New York City, as an example. So let's say that the probability of being a lawyer, we're going to be very generous. We're going to say that it's 10%, right? And let's say that's going to be law. I apologize for the handwriting. I'm using a mouse on this. And let's say that the probability of them from being from New York City, a lawyer, we're going to say that is also going to be 10%, just because it would be easy math. Now, if I told you, hey, I have this friend, he works for a consulting agency in the Northeast. They make lots of money, that they went to graduate school. You may be getting a couple of ideas that pop into your head about who this individual is. And you may think, oh, I bet that person is a lawyer from New York. If you do, then the probability is never going to be greater than 10%. Why? Because the probability of just being a lawyer is 10%. The probability of just being from New York City is also 10%. Now, technically, if we wanted to apply this to look at what is the likely outcome of that, it's actually going to be 1%, the 1% likelihood that they are a lawyer from New York, because 10 by 10 is 1%. So the likelihood of them being a lawyer from New York City is 1%, but we might conflate this and say, like, oh, well, it sounds like they're likely to be that. And so maybe if you heard that description, you might say that, oh, maybe the likelihood is 15%. That can't be possible. That can't be possible because we have already said likelihood is 10%, and likelihood here is 10% as well. All right, so let me just give you an example, because I know that can be a little bit esoteric. Let's say that I give you this description of an individual. So this person is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy as a student. She was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So that is the description of this individual that we have in mind. I want you to try to imagine what this person is like. I want you to try to imagine maybe their Twitter profile or their Twitter feed or what they're interested in on Facebook and stuff like that. So try to imagine what this person is, what they do in their day job, and all that other stuff. So whenever people are given this description, this is based on an old study that Daniel Kahneman did. That when people are given this description, they're given a couple of options to choose from that would help describe this person whose name is Linda. They could say that either Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement, or Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is active in the feminist movement. So you got these three options. So what happens is most people will actually say this piece right here, that people are going to say that Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement, instead of just Linda is a bank teller or Linda is active in the feminist movement. Which is bizarre, right? Because what we just talked about was, like, let's say, for example, that the likelihood of being a bank teller is 5%, and the likelihood of being activist in the feminine movement is, let's say, 40%, right? And if that is the case, then it's impossible for someone to be both of these and that probability greater than 40%, right? Because by definition, if they are both of these things, at the very most, they can be the highest of these probabilities, which is 40%. So at the very best, she has a 40% likelihood of being both of these things, but more likely, it's going to be less than that. But that is the conjunction fallacy. That essentially what we're saying is that if that it's much more likely that that somebody is one characteristic instead of two characteristics combined. However, we like to say that people are two characteristics combined because it feels like we're using good evidence in that case. All right, so let's talk about base rate neglect again. We're talking about the representativeness heuristic. You'll see how this all fits together here. Basically, I'm going to talk about the Tom W. experiment. This is an experiment from the 70s that Kahneman and Tversky did. And essentially what they did is they divided up their participants into three different groups. So I'm going to give you some examples of what they did here. So the first group got this information. Consider all first-year graduate students in the United States. What is your best guess about the percentage of students that are currently enrolled in business administration, computer science, engineering, humanities and education, law, library science, medicine, physical and life sciences, and social science / social work? So for you, you're playing along at home, what I invite you to do is to think about these things. Just jot down if you can, or make a mental note of the percentages here. What do you think is the percentage of students that are in graduate school in each of these things? You don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to, perfectly add up to 100. Just give rough estimates. Because I promise you, if you do, this experiment will make more sense if you are doing that. Usually whenever I do this in the classroom, people will say that the most common, the most frequent of these are going to be business administration, maybe medicine, and maybe social science / social work. Those are usually, and also education. So those are usually the ones that are the highest. The ones that rank among the lowest are generally going to be library science, physical sciences, and computer science and engineering. Those are usually the ones that are lower. So just keep that in mind. So groups 2 and 3 got a little bit different information. So both of them got information about this character named Tom W. So I'm going to read this very quickly. Tom W. is of high intelligence, although lacking in true creativity. He has a need for order and clarity, and for neat and tidy systems in which every detail finds its appropriate place. His writing is rather dull and mechanical, occasionally enlivened by somewhat corny puns and flashes of imagination of the sci-fi type. He has a strong drive for competence. He seems to feel little sympathy for other people and does not enjoy interacting with others. Self-centered, he nonetheless has a deep moral sense. All right, so that is the profile of Tom W. So the second group basically got that characteristic of that profile of Tom W. and said, how similar is Tom W. compared to typical students in these things? So basically what they were asked to do is to rank on a scale of 1 to 9, how similar is he compared to the typical student in these things? And again, I encourage you to try this yourself. Usually when I'm in the classroom, people will say that he is more like computer science, engineering, and maybe life sciences. Sometimes people will say law, sometimes people will say medicine. Oh, library science as well. And they say that he's probably less like somebody in medicine, somebody in social science, and less like somebody in education. All right. Group 3 then, and this is the crucial group, is how likely, based on that profile description, how likely is it that Tom W. is currently a student in these fields? So again, I want you to think, how likely do you think he is in one of these programs? Again, when I teach this in class, people will say that he's more likely to be in computer science, to be in engineering, to be in library sciences, to be in physical and life sciences, and that he's less likely to be in education, that he's less likely to be in social sciences and social work. All right, and that illustrates the representativeness heuristic. Did you catch what it was? So what it was is basically that the group 3 rates are much closer to group 2's decision than group's 1 decision. So how is that an example of a heuristic? Basically, the whole purpose of group 1 was to go through and to highlight and to explain what the base rate probabilities of graduate programs are. We basically rank them in terms of, what is, how populous are they. And so we have an idea about what are the most popular graduate programs. And then in group 2, we were asked how similar is he to these things. And then we ranked those. And then in group 3, we asked how likely is it that he is in there. Now, if you were paying very close attention to the previous video, then you probably figured out what the trick was. That basically, if you are saying that the most popular graduate programs are education, are social sciences, then we should say that he's most likely to come out of those programs, that we know that there are more people in those programs, so it's more likely that he comes out of those programs. But instead, that's generally not what people do. What people do instead is that they will say that he fits the stereotype of things like library science, life sciences, engineering, computer sciences, and things like that, even though we established that those are less popular graduate programs altogether. So in that case, most people are going to agree that Tom W. is most likely to study computer science, even though we know that the base rates for social sciences and education are way higher. All right, so that's the representativeness heuristic. When you're making that decision there, what you're essentially doing is you have this idea of Tom W., this prototype of him maybe even, or a prototype of a computer science student, or a law student, a medicine student, a social sciences student, and you're comparing him compared to those prototypes, those concepts that you conjured. All right, so let's look at the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is the idea that depending on the context in which we are in, things that have happened recently to us are easier for us to make decisions about. They feel more common if they happen recently. So we are more likely to say that things are probable whenever they just happened. Why? Because they are recent in our memory. So they're recently there. It's easier for us to think of examples of them, and so we think that they are more common than they actually are. So an example of that, and this is not one that is in the news per se, but kind of a cool illustration nonetheless. So, are there more words in the English language that start with the letter T or start with the letter K? I'm going to make a quick decision here. So, almost all of you are going to say that there are many more words that start with the letter T than the letter K. Why? Because generally it's much easier for us to think of words that start with K. Much easier for us to think of words that start with T than for K, right? You can think of T, you got table, you got tea, you got tool, you got time, you got temperature, you got tamarind, you got teal, till. That's all, right? That's all the words that start with the letter T. But you get the idea. It's easier for us to imagine those, to think of those. Now, if you were to do the same thing with the letter K, you could get, kite, kangaroo, Kool-Aid, right? It's a little bit harder to think of words that start with K. And if you said that the answer is T, you're absolutely right, that there are more words in the English language that start with the letter T than start with letter K. That is absolutely true. Now, to make another quick decision, are there more words in the English language whose first letter begins with the letter K, or whose third letter is the letter K? I'll let you think about that one. So, most people, when they are doing this, are going to say that there are more words that start with the letter K. But that's actually not true. There are many, many, many more times words that whose third letter is the letter K than is first letter, the letter K. It's just that whenever we are thinking about the letter K, it's much easier for us to think of examples where the first letter is the letter K. But if you start thinking about it, you'll notice a lot of words whose third letter is K. Any example of like baking, taking, raking, faking, they all have K as the third letter. Acknowledge, that has the third letter. But there are many more examples whose third letter is the letter K. It's just that they're a little bit harder for us to immediately imagine. So they're less recent in our memory. And that's the availability heuristic. That basically what we're saying here is that things that are available to us, we're going to say are more common or more frequent than things that are not. So to apply this to the news, which baseball team has won more World Series titles? The Oakland A or the Los Angeles Dodgers? So if you're looking at this and if you're a baseball fan, great. If you're not, you can probably still make a guess here. Most people are going to say that the Los Angeles Dodgers have more World Series title wins than the Oakland A's, but it's actually not true. The Oakland A's have 9 World Series titles compared to the Dodgers, only 6. So why is it that feels strange? The reason why is because the Oakland A's have not been a great baseball team recently in the same way that the Dodgers have, right? The Dodgers were on this hot streak recently in the past couple of years where they did really well and took home some World Series titles, whereas the Oakland A's have not. And because of that, it's easier for us to remember the Los Angeles Dodgers being in the news for this kind of thing, and so we say that they're more likely. And if you are a baseball fan and you want to quibble with this, I totally understand. The Oakland A's, this is also counting their title wins whenever they were the Philadelphia Athletics or the Philadelphia A's too. I'm not trying to play tricks there. I think that's perfectly fine. So for most people that I come across in New England, though, even though you might like baseball, you might like the Sox, most people seem to gravitate towards football. And so to give you a football example, which football team has more Super Bowl wins? Is it the Pittsburgh Steelers or the New England Patriots? At the time of this recording, both teams are tied. So both teams have won 6 Super Bowls. But it feels like the Patriots have more more than Steelers because we know they've won a lot recently. And because of that, it's easier for us to imagine memories of them having these World Series, these Super Bowl wins compared to the Steelers, who it's been a while since they've won a Super Bowl. We see this all the time in the news. We see it whenever people are talking about violence in cities. If you were to turn on the news, it sounds like city violence is worse than it's ever been before, right? When in fact, some of the rates of crime in cities is the lowest that it's been since like the 70s or so. But because we see it on the news, we tend to think that it's more common than it actually is. And the same is true for another example is if I asked you to tell me how many times in presidential history has the Electoral College, has the president lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College vote? Most people, when they think about that, will say, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, but the answer is lower than that. The answer is actually only 3 times. It's just that 2 of those times have been in recent memory with Donald Trump and with George Bush. And because of that, it's easy for us to think that it's more common than it actually is. It's not common really to happen at all, but because when it has happened has been recently, it's easy for us to think of those because they are available in our memory to make. So basically, that availability influences how common, how frequent we think things are. The anchoring heuristic, this is a little bit different than the previous 2. The anchoring heuristic is just how information that we receive can bias our decision making. So I'm just going to move straight down to this figure down here. If I were to ask you, without looking at that, how many times a day do you smile? And I want you to think about writing that number down. You're going to have a number on there, right? But if I asked you using this scale, how many times a day do you smile? That's going to change the way that you respond to that decision. Because ultimately, if somebody asked me how many times a day do I smile, I would say, I don't know, 5 times, 6 times maybe. I feel like I'm a happy person, but I'm trying to think about the times that I, smile. But if I were given this scale from 0 to 100 plus, that's going to change my decision making, because otherwise I would say, oh, well, I guess in that case I'm right around down here, right? That's around how many times I smile. But because I think of myself as a happy person, I'm going to weigh that 5 to 6 times that man, my handwriting is so bad here, to the scale. And I think, well, I'm probably more than average, so I'm going to say that maybe I'm right around here, which is actually like 65, almost 65 times that I've smiled a day. That is so many more times. It's just that the way this information is presented is influencing, it's biasing the way that I respond there. So let me give you some examples and so this is why whenever you're developing psychological assessments and tools that study behavior, you want to be very, very careful when you do stuff like this. You can easily see how a scale like this might bias the way that people respond to this specific task. Another example here is if I were to ask you which of these two groups is smarter. So if we were to combine their IQs, which of these is going to be the highest group? Is it group 1, which is Hulk Hogan, Isaac Newton, and Marie Curie? Or is it group 2, Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and Floyd Mayweather? So usually when I ask this in the classroom, or ask questions like this in the classroom, people will usually say that group 2 is a little bit smarter than group 1. When in fact, basically the only difference here is the way that it's presented. We know that Hulk Hogan, not known for his brains. We know that Floyd Mayweather, not known for his brains either. But we do know that Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking are geniuses, or were geniuses, and same for Isaac Newton and for Marie Curie. So, what happens is that group 1, we immediately start out with Hulk Hogan. So we're starting out below average, and then we get Isaac Newton, which is above average, and we get Marie Curie, which is also above average. And so we say that, oh, well, I guess, the IQ here is going to be above average, right? Whereas group 2, we have Albert Einstein, so we're starting off saying, like, okay, super smart, Stephen Hawking, super smart, Floyd Mayweather, not as smart. And so we're going to say that now that's really above average, because we're starting out with these two people that are very, very smart. All right, so, and maybe you would say that, okay, well, maybe, there's some subjectivity here, and I understand. I'll give you another example. So this was also done with other, basically we need to create two groups here, but what I want you to do is to immediately give me a guess, and I mean, don't calculate it, don't even try to calculate it, just give me a rough estimate of where you think this number lands. What is the product of 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1? So I want you to think of whatever that number is. And then think of what is the product of these numbers. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8. What happens is that whenever people are given these numbers, you're going to find that people who are given this order, where you have it starting out with 8 times 6 times 7, are going to give a higher number than people that are given this one, which is given a lower number. Even though we know that when we multiply all these together, we're going to get the exact same product, we're going to get the exact same number, we think of them differently because of what is weighed first. That's why it's called anchoring, because essentially your judgment is kind of being anchored by, which is going to bias it high, bias it low, depending on what comes first. In this case, we see that these big numbers come first, and because of that, we're going to assume that this is a high number compared to this number, even though we know that they are going to be identical in that case. All right, so very quickly, some other heuristics. We get the recognition heuristic, which is that whenever something is recognizable, we assume that it is more valuable than things that are unrecognizable. The affect heuristic, which is whenever something activates our emotions, it tends to be more, that information, that evidence tends to be more persuasive than other things. So essentially, and you see this a lot with like political messaging, where people will use Actually, you always see, usually you see in political speeches, you'll have people talk about a story. They'll give you a story about, I don't know, some single income family or single parent family who the parent worked 4 jobs to make things work, and because of that, we need to lower taxes or raise taxes or provide funds for public education or to provide funds for charter schools. You get the idea. That basically you're going to get this kind of emotional message because that makes that information that follows it more persuasive. The scarcity heuristic, which is basically that whenever we perceive something as difficult to obtain or something that is rare, we think that it is more valuable. So, for example, if I told you that I don't know, think of an author that you like. Let's say, I don't know, J.K. Rowling or Suzanne Collins or I guess I don't. Celeste Ng, who wrote Little Fires Everywhere. Like, let's say that your favorite author, they wrote a book and there's only one of them published in the entire world. Think about how valuable that book would be. When in fact, obviously, the inherent value of it is not more or less than any other book this person has written. It's just that we think that, oh, this is rare, it's scarce, it must be worth more. My favorite example of this is actually, there was a Wu-Tang album that was written and recorded, and only one of them was ever made. Only one copy of this was ever made, and they sold it for like $5 million or something like that. It was super rare. But the reason why they were able to sell it for $5 million is because there's only one of them in existence. So you get the idea there. And then finally, we have the effort heuristic. The effort heuristic is essentially that whenever something seems or we perceive it to have taken more effort to create, that it must be more valuable. So let's say that that same author that you thought about, let's say that they just released a book that they wrote in 2 weeks versus a book that they wrote for 20 years. Which of those do you think is going to be better? Most people are going to say the one that took 20 years to write. Why? Because we just assume that, oh, well, if it took more effort, it must be more valuable, it must be better. In that case. All right, so that's all that I want to talk about for this particular chapter. Thanks for hanging in. I know this is one of the longer videos we've done. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video, which is all about reasoning. Bye.